Welcome to Minding Men. My name is Brian Pollack here during the coronavirus, and I'm so excited to bring you a wonderful mental health recovery advocate, Brian Cuban. He is a Dallas-based attorney, graduate of Penn State University and the University of Pittsburgh School of Law. He's been in long-term recovery from alcohol, cocaine, and bulimia since April of 2007. That's 13 years. Brian,
Yeah.
welcome.
Thanks for having me on, Brian.
I'm so happy to have you here. I've known about you. I've read some of your books. I have heard you speak. I've watched your videos, and I'm just lucky to have you. Thank
Thanks.
you.
Two Brians. We're doing good today.
Hopefully, two Brians make a right.
That's right. With an eye.
So, just to get right into it, you speak so much and so candidly about your mental health, personally, professionally. Where'd you find the courage to speak up, stand up, and do something about it?
It was a progression. I first went public with my mental health struggles around 2007, but it was not my drug use and my alcohol use. It was my bulimia that I first went public about, my eating disorder struggle. And I went public. I wrote a blog about it, going public. And I was scared and I was ashamed and I was expecting a lot of pushback because guys with eating disorders is very stigmatized. Yeah. It is even today thought of as a quote unquote female disorder, even though about 20% or so of all those with eating disorders are male.
Oh, can I jump in real quick? 30 to 40% now.
Oh, so now we're up to 30 to 40%. Okay, it shows I'm out of date on the stats.
It's moving and grooving, thank goodness, right?
Yes. But males are still much more likely to seek treatment, and it can be very shameful. So I was expecting to be shamed, and I wasn't. And the responses were supportive from males and females, and it was then that started my dipping my toe into the advocacy arena.
Wow. It had to be almost validating that maybe you got a story, you got something to say here.
Yes, it was validating in that it wasn't something that other people thought of as shameful, even if I did, at least those people who responded and spoke out.
Yeah.
And so it was. And validation is good in terms of mental health, in terms of dealing with shame, when to realize that it's not.
Absolutely.
Of course, it can be bad if people validate that it is by shaming you.
Well, that's one of the tricks is that if they start shaming you, you have to find a way to believe that actually you're not to be shamed. And how do you face that?
Absolutely. And I was very lucky because at that time I didn't have those tools. And if people would have just jumped on me about it, then who knows what direction I may have gone off in.
For men and mental health in general, that is such a huge aspect. There's so much shame, embarrassment, vulnerability. It's almost like we can't be strong if we admit to having something wrong with us. When you started doing this work, or just your own personal work, coming to terms with that, what was that like for you?
Being male, allowing myself to be vulnerable to the public. It's a process. Again, it's a process because you're right. And especially for people like me, I'm a boomer. I was born in 1961. We're on the cusp of Gen X boomer. But I'm from a generation in which males we do not cry. We do not show weakness. We do not show vulnerability. That is how our parents, my dad, the greatest generation, right? Yeah. That is how generally our parents they didn't express their feelings. My mom had her mental health struggles at a time when for a woman to talk about depression or anything like that, you could be institutionalized. So that is what is handed down in terms of the stigma and the machismo type thing that we just cannot allow ourselves to show these feelings. Yeah. And so that was a process for me to get over that. Wow. And when I did start getting over that and putting it out there, and I put it out there, every aspect of my life, there was some pushback, but again, I'm in therapy and through therapy and a lot of different types of therapy, CBT, ACT, I learned to deal with that and understand that these people are not my thoughts. I am not my thoughts. And to get good with this vulnerability and understanding that it's okay to cry. It's okay to be me. It's okay to feel.
That's great. It's interesting. You talk about this demeanor of the great generation, right? The greatest generation, and this kind of stoicism, machismo, and then at the same time, your mom, if she were to say she was depressed, she would be institutionalized, and that is a long stymied history of our mental health
Sure.
system. How, for you, did you take that on and deal with that growing up, and how did it affect you?
Okay, and to back up, my mom, I don't know that my mom would have been, right?
Yeah.
I'm not putting that on my dad, but that was the stigma then.
Yeah.
And so for me as a young boy, and there is a history here, there was a lot of fat shaming in my household. I was an obese child. I would come home from school eating Chef Boyardee ravioli, and my mom would watch me and say, "If you eat like that, you're going to turn into a fat pig." And these were the things my grandmother said to my mother. And so this was the kind of dynamic that I was dealing with as a young boy. An Eastern European Jewish family had this relationship around food, and a very dysfunctional relationship around food. My grandmother was always putting it in front of my mother. My mother's putting it in front of me. So I grew very ashamed of my body, and I gained a lot of weight, and I was bullied severely in high school.
Ooh.
There was an incident in which my brother, Mark, had given me a pair of shiny gold bell-bottom disco pants. This was the era of Saturday Night Fever. This was the mid-70s, 76, 77. And for those who don't know, John Travolta, Saturday Night Fever, a great movie. And the pants weren't tight on Mark, but I wore them and they were tight on me. And I'm telling you what, I had to jump up and down, spray the water bottle. My butt looked like 15 cats back there, but I didn't care. I love my brother. We're very close. And I wore those pants to school, my stomach hanging out, and the kids made fun of me. It all culminated walking home with these kids who were, in my mind, the popular kids, the kids I wanted to be like, the prom king, the prom queen, the kids going to the football games together. But they were also some of the bullies. They decided I was just too fat to wear those pants, and they physically assaulted me on a sidewalk a mile from my house, and they pantsed me. They ripped those pants off me, my shiny gold bell-bottom disco pants, tore them into shreds, threw them out in the street out of my Fruit of the Loom tighty whities. This was in Pittsburgh. I had a Pittsburgh Pirates t-shirt on, my tube socks and my Keds tennis shoes. Gathered them up in the street, busy street, covered up my privates and waddled home. People gawked, no one stopped. And I hid those pants and hid my shame, didn't want anyone to know what happened.
Yeah.
And it was then that incident was so traumatic, Brian, that I could go to Pittsburgh today and show you exactly where it happened. And that incident, that trauma, that traumatic core formed kind of the kryptonite core of how I saw myself in my reflection moving forward in my life as a young Brian, the shame, the fat pig. And I need to make it clear, I do not blame my mother for these things that I went through. There is a difference between cause and correlation.
Absolutely.
But things that can happen at home can correlate with things later in life, mental health issues later in life. Fat shaming can. It won't for everyone. That's why it's correlation. People have different environmental and genetic makeups and social makeups. But for me, as somebody who already had a negative self-image, who was classic middle child syndrome, I'm the middle of three, who internalized anything negative said to him and wore it like a skin-tight suit. It was a perfect storm for me. Yeah. And that was really the traumatic beginning of how I saw myself as a young boy. This shameful fat pig, not worthy of love from my mother, who did love me dearly, who would never kiss a girl, who would never go hold a girl's hands, who would never go on a date, who would go through his life completely alone.
Think about all that worth and all of that kind of stigma flying in and flying out and all these difficulties. And then you have to cope with this in some way, right? And I know you struggled with bulimia. And as you worked through that as an adult, it sounds like you've already done a lot of the repair work in your own kind of brain and understanding to make sense of this for yourself.
I've been through a lot of therapy. You went through it just wasn't bulimia. It started with bulimia, then transitioned to exercise bulimia, which, if you're, for your listeners, is obsessive compulsive exercise for the primary purpose of offsetting calories. My biggest recovery struggle sitting here today. Then it transitioned into alcohol use disorder, quote unquote alcoholism, and then transitioned into cocaine use disorder. I became addicted to cocaine. And all of these were revolving, all of these destructive behaviors were revolving around the core of this hurt, shame little boy that I had been dragging around on a tire, this tractor trailer tire attached to a chain through the decades, just dragging him and putting all of the shame and pain and packing it away in a compartmentalized suitcase in my body and never opening it up to explore it. Because what happens when you open up the suitcase? The Pandora's box opens up. Yeah. So you just keep putting it all in there and it just keeps stuffing and stuffing, right? Until one day it bursts open. It bursts open in eating disorders. It bursts open in alcohol use, problem drinking. It bursts open in cocaine use.
Absolutely. The experience of, wanting to kind of hold all that in, compartmentalize, suffocate it, shut it out, hide it, however you want to put it, just to find some sense of worth outside of this. I can imagine being a guy growing up in the 70s, becoming an adult in the 80s, 90s, and so on and so forth, seeing this kind of myriad change of, or even lack of change sometimes in our, let's call it media, around being a man.
Absolutely.
How has that affected you, allowed you, or not allowed you to?
Well, that's a great question, because the core of that was also formed when I began to binge and purge.
Okay.
I did not know what bulimia was. I believe when I started binging and purging in 79, moving into 1980, bulimia, I believe, had only been a clinical diagnosis for about 4 years or so.
Right.
And so I did not know what that was. I didn't know what an eating disorder was, but I instinctively knew in every bone, every fiber, every hair on my arm that this was something guys did not stick their fingers down their throats and regurgitate their food. That was just not something men did. That wasn't manly. So as a freshman in college, I did everything I could to camouflage it. But this feeling of not being manly is something that kind of stuck with me. And all of the stigma. And it really was an undercurrent of a lot of the shame that I went through. And very difficult to break through. And it's a lot of therapy. I'm in therapy today, 15 years. I think everyone should get some therapy.
I'm a therapist. Yes. Including therapists.
Yeah.
The idea of trying to understand that I'm not a man if I'm doing this particular compulsive action, or even sometimes exercise purging or exercise bulimia can feel like it's a masculine trait, believe it or not. What are some of the more powerful dynamics characteristically that you felt at the time or even today that seem to bring about achievement, success, control that sometimes can be a bit difficult to grasp or find in your life?
Do you mean, I'm not sure I understand the question.
Yeah, it's kind of a loaded question, so I'll pare it down, and I apologize for that. More, when you were going through this, particularly back in your recovery days, was there an idealized man?
Okay. We have to remember, when I was in college, high school and college, this was before the internet. So my images weren't photoshopped muscular guys that we see when we go on Instagram and all these things, people putting on their best airbrush faces, right? Perfect. Right. They were the kids every day. These were the kids I saw every day. So my images revolved around popularity versus versus ripped shirts.
Yeah, that makes sense. Sure.
So, but in my mind, there were no fat kids that were popular. And the quote unquote fat, and I use that term for the lack of a better term.
Let's say a person of a different size.
A person of a heavier size, an obese person. in my mind, they were the people who were the class clowns, like I tried to be, because I didn't feel I could be popular. At least that's how I projected my shame, to make myself feel better. So I didn't have images. I had context of popularity. And in my mind, they were all football players. They were all thin. And so I wanted to be that. But the problem is, Brian, is that every time I looked in the mirror, and this was going on while I was binging and purging and restricting as well. Every time I looked in the mirror, every time I saw my reflection in a car window, a classroom window, all I saw was this huge stomach, no matter how thin I got. This fat pig. And so as long as I saw that, I had to lose more weight, because if I lose more weight, or if I binged and purged tonight, then tomorrow I'll be popular. Tomorrow the kids will like me. Tomorrow that girl I like will like me. I'll get my first date, my first kiss. And it's this obsessive compulsive, cycle, day in and day out, a 24-hour mind loop. I have to do these things to be loved, to feel like a man.
Right. And nowadays we have some wonderful, wonderful research, as well as experts in the world, starting to recognize that body diversity is beautiful. And that the more we can accept our own biological tendencies and understand that stabilizing how we can eat and feel about ourselves doesn't matter about our body size. I kind of wonder personally how that younger Brian Cuban, if he had access to that, how he would have dealt with it.
Man, that's a tough question, because it's just, he didn't have access to it, right?
Exactly.
So, I mean, obviously, if there was more education, more awareness at that time, we might have seen a different family dynamic in my house. Even though, again, correlation and causation, we have these wonderful resources now, and this stuff still goes on. I get emails from young men and females too about body shaming at home. And their parents are obsessed with weight and dieting. Their parents are constantly criticizing or critiquing their body shape. This goes on today because there's still a lot of generational baggage. If that was done to their parents, right? So that's the problem, Brian. How do we break the cycle? Because generations are still passing down these coping mechanisms.
Yes. And we're talking about generational trauma. And
yes.
Mind you come from, and I even come from, families that have been around in Eastern Europe during certain times. And there are some interesting biological aspects associated with what our ancestors have gone through, but even more getting off of that societally. And now we're all stuck in our cauldron of our own homes around generational traumas that possibly are being passed on in the home because we're stuck in coronavirus. How do you suggest, or how are you at this point getting through some of the difficulties, more of like the projective fears about body and needing to look a certain way?
That's a great question. I get asked all the time what my greatest recovery struggle is today.
Yeah.
Not cocaine. I don't hang around. That if I was put around it, that might be a recovery struggle, because that would be a bigger trigger than alcohol. But but I don't hang out with people who use cocaine. I changed my recovery circle. I changed my circles. Alcohol is not an issue to me. But what do I have to do every day? I have to eat.
Right.
Eat to live, right? You have to eat to live.
Right.
And so my mind, even after all this therapy, and I still deal with this through different types of therapy, acceptance and commitment, but my mind can still look at that morning bagel and automatically convert it to calories. And then that can easily trigger to, okay, well, I need to spend this much today. And so the shame that can go with a full feeling in my stomach, that maybe I've overeaten or eaten too much, that is still a part of my struggle today. And that is something I have to be very self-aware of, because that could trip me over into all of a sudden I'm doing 4 spin classes a day.
Yeah, it's the limits you have to be aware
That's right. And so I have to be very present in my relationship with food, very mindful in my mindful eating, my relationship with food, mindful exercise, and understanding that I am not defined by my body. I am enough, whether I have love handles, whether I'm losing my hair, which I am, all of these different body things that go with age, right?
Yes.
And just go with life. I am enough, whatever I see in the mirror. I can love Brian, whatever I see, however Brian looks. Backing up, I get asked a lot, and there's an interrelationship here. When I walked into 12-step, I got sober in 12-step. When I walked into 12-step for the very first time to begin my abstinence journey in drinking, I sat in that chair for the first time. I didn't know if I was a quote unquote alcoholic, and there's a connection here.
Yeah.
I sat in that chair because if sitting in that chair in that room of 12-step would allow me for the first time in my life to walk up to a mirror in my bathroom, birthday suit naked, heavy, thin, bald, pimples, look in that mirror and love Brian without the aid of binging and purging, without the aid of cocaine, without the alcohol, I would sit in that room. So when I went into the rooms of 12-step, it was as much about loving myself as abstinence from drinking, loving my body. So there was a connection there. And so sitting here in our COVID new paradigm, yes, that is a struggle for me. And I have to wake up every morning and understand that these are the behaviors I could engage in. These are the behaviors I will engage in. Yes. And so I try to stay very present in that.
That's tough stuff to do. It really is.
It is.
I cannot commend you more for just being aware and challenging yourself and recognizing recovery is a paradigm at times. It sometimes can feel like, okay, I'm great, I'm good today. But sometimes there are triggers and limits that we kind of face, and we have to start as we mature. We have to navigate those things because our world is ever changing.
That's right. And one of the biggest challenges of all that is we're navigating it without the normal physical compassionate community that we may normally have. Zoom meetings are great, but I can't touch, right? It's still different. Yeah. And so how do we keep that core of compassion around us with our community of people that we can reach out to, who can reach out to us? And I'm fortunate because I understood that I have to reimagine that community. And I have my brothers. I am in privilege. I have a good family. My wife is understanding. I have people I can reach out to and who will also reach out to me. But for a male and a female struggling with body image or substance use, that can be difficult when all of a sudden we don't have the warmth, the closeness, the connection, and sitting there, and it builds on itself and it builds on itself. And all of a sudden our thoughts become facts, which they are not, right? And then they trip over into the behavior.
Yes. And this is happening everywhere. It's happening at people who don't have mental health disorders and are stuck at home. It's happening to people who struggle with mental health disorders. It is something that is everywhere with coronavirus, and trying to believe and understand that our thoughts are not facts, and recovery or just feel good or connection can be on that other side. You say it so eloquently. I love it. Thank you for saying that. I appreciate it.
Thank you. And I think it's important when we talk about compassionate community that compassionate community is a two-way thing. Connections going each way. So when you're sitting alone, I call it a compassion wheel. Draw a little circle. Who do you know that you care about? Who do you know that cares about you? Put them in the circle. Have you spoken to them? Have they spoken to you? And when you are creating that compassion circle of people who can support you and who you can support, we get back to thoughts are not facts.
Yes.
Because here's what I get all the time, Brian. Well, this person, but I'm not going to call them. They have kids, they have their family, they're struggling. I can't put another thing. So your thoughts have become facts, and you have projected out all of this angst and every reason not to allow them to support you, when the reality is they'd probably love to hear from you.
Absolutely. And also on the other end, sometimes we're afraid to see we're always giving, we're always pushing out there because we want that validation and connection in that compassion wheel. And we can get burnt out if we're not being able to receive.
Absolutely.
It's really a very dynamite.
That's why it works two ways. It's the subway going each way. Who can you call? Don't project out that they're going to say, I have no time for you. Let them support you, right?
Yeah.
Let them give it to you. Let them give you their love. Let them give you their empathy, because that is healing.
Absolutely. And it's hard to find those people sometimes. Sometimes we can find truths that upset us, but that's the whole part of being human, is recognizing there's other ways of compassion to connect. And there's many different, maybe that person's struggling and can't understand that type of concept. It's really hard to do.
It is. And that's why people don't create the wheel, because to do so has to acknowledge truths about relationships.
Yeah.
So, but I have found it very helpful for me day in and day out. Who are the people that can support me? Who are the people I support when I need it and when I can give it?
Who are the people in your neighborhood, right?
That's right. Mr. Rogers' neighborhood.
It always goes back to Mr. Rogers, doesn't it?
That's right. I don't have that virtual background up today.
When I didn't
want to distract from this.
Thank you. When I first met you, you had the Mr. Rogers background. It was fantastic.
Yes. Yeah.
So yes, and so can you tell us a little bit? We only have a few minutes left. Where can we find you? What is the work you're currently doing, and where do we find out more?
I am a mental health recovery advocate. I have 2 books out. My last one is called The Addicted Lawyer. It's basically more about substance use, mental health, depression in the legal profession. But briancuban.com, Brian with an I, www, is where you can see my videos about mental health. I cut videos all the time, everything I've written. My book's on Amazon. My first book, Shattered Image, is harder to find, but that book is about my struggle with body image and eating disorders. Yeah. And so that is what I do. I speak publicly at different events about my recovery. I don't claim to be an expert. I don't claim to be a therapist. I claim to be a guy with a story, and a guy that says it's okay to cry. It's okay for men to cry. It's okay to shed a tear at a movie trailer. It's okay to shed a tear at the dead squirrel in the road. It's okay to feel your feelings.
Rock on. I agree 100%. And whether you like it or not, I'm going to call you an expert, because the thing is, experts don't always know everything. Experts are always learning. And in order to be an expert, you always have to feel like you're not an expert. And that's
I do my best to know what I don't know.
Bingo. Thank you, Brian, so much for coming to Minding Men. I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. It was an honor and a pleasure. Stay safe, stay healthy, stay balanced.
You too. And everybody, thank you for joining us on MLTV Network during the coronavirus. Hopefully one day I'll be at the studio, and I'm missing being out there with everybody else. And we're so honored to have Brian have joined us. And stay safe and healthy out there, and we'll see you soon.